Native Americans. Inspired by the African American Civil Rights Movement, Native Americans began to aggressively pursue changes in their status in the U.S. Dozens of broken government treaties, massacres of Indian people such as in Wounded Knee in 1890, forced removal from tribal lands during the Trail of Tears, and finally the termination policy in which the federal government ended any formal relationship it had with the tribes, left most Indians embittered and angry at what they saw still as an illegal colonial government. Side by side with the rise in black militancy and the call for black power, Native Americans called for red power, reflecting patriotic Indians' fight for freedom from injustice, bondage, patronizing treatment from the government, and oppression. Now here's some interesting statistics. As of 1971, the average Indian lived almost 7 years less than the average lifespan of all other Americans. They earned 75% less than the average American income, $1,000 less than the average black family. Unemployment among Indians was 40%, 10 times larger than the national average at that time. The infant mortality rate was 3 times higher than the national average, and the suicide rate of Indian teens was 100 times higher than that of whites. Clearly, Indian Americans were suffering as a group. Red Power called Indians to come together to fight against the cause of that suffering. The American Indian Movement, also known as AIM, formed in the early 1970s to publicize both natives' plight and their quest for justice. Utilizing the press as a tool to get their message out, they staged dramatic protests and demonstrations to call attention to their cause. In 1970, they seized and occupied the replica of the Mayflower on Thanksgiving Day. In 1971, they occupied Mount Rushmore. In 1972, they organized a march, the Trail of Broken Treaties, and later that year occupied the federal government's Bureau of Indian Affairs. In February of 1973, AIM seized control of the town Wounded Knee in South Dakota. The U.S. Marshals tried to negotiate and even blocked off the entry of food to try to starve out AIM. Eventually violence broke out and both AIM and Marshals exchanged rapid sporadic gunfire, which ultimately led to the death of 2 AIM members. After a 71-day standoff, AIM ultimately ended their occupation of Wounded Knee and entered into federal custody. Some of its members still serve time in jail. Despite its efforts and the attention it garnered, in 1972, actor Marlon Brando refused the Best Actor Oscar he won for his role in The Godfather because of how Native Americans were depicted on television and film. AIM did little to curb the stereotypes and treatment of Native peoples. For instance, in sports, Cleveland's baseball team is still called the Indians. Washington, D.C.'s football team is still called the Redskins, a moniker as insulting to Native Americans as the N-word is to blacks. But by the end of the 20th century, tribes would win significant legal battles to own, maintain, and run casinos on their own tribal lands, even in states that had banned gambling. This resulted in a dramatic influx of money and financial security for tribes across the country. Farm workers. Prior to the 1960s, migrant farm workers had suffered decades of exploitation, low wages, unsafe working conditions, and long hours, much to the profit of agricultural owners across the West, especially in California. Believing that they had no protections as they weren't citizens, laborers did little to resist this mistreatment. Even though there were periods in our history in which we encouraged migrant labor, such as the Bracero movement during World War II, migrant laborers were historically treated like second-class humans. Again, influenced by black activists like King and Malcolm X, farm workers named Cesar Chavez and Dolores Huerta decided to take action in the early 1960s. Organizing the United Farm Workers Organizing Committee, or simply the UFW, Chavez and Huerta vigorously organized farm workers up and down California's San Joaquin Valley. No easy feat when you consider that these are people who did not have access to reliable forms of communication like telephones or even steady mailing addresses. Adopting King's tactics of nonviolence, the UFW pushed for California grape growers to recognize their union and make some conciliatory gestures towards their laborers. Their chief complaints ranged from being forced to use small gardening tools, which required that workers spend up to 12 hours a day bent over double, which resulted in chronic back problems. The UFW called for an end to farmers' practice of crop dusting fields while laborers were on the farms. This at a time when the now banned pesticide DDT was widely used. They also called for an end to deceitful payment practices, which charged workers for tools they didn't own, taxes like Social Security from which they received no benefit, and work breaks which they never took. Through employing peaceful marches, serving voluntary jail sentences, going on hunger strikes, and the skillful use of the media, Chavez won migrant laborers significant rights and protections in their contracts with farmers throughout California. The Uvas No, which means no grapes movement, showed growers that a people without legal citizenship, no significant financial base, and very little political power could cut growers' profits in the grape market so strongly that they had no choice but to negotiate with Huerta and Chavez. March 31st has since become Cesar Chavez Day in California, a day of observance and recognition of the birth of the man who gave those who had nothing so much to hope for.